Take our hearts and seethe them. Take our souls and set them on fire. Amen. We live in a really big world. Lots of things are going on. More things are going on that we're aware of nowadays than we used to be aware of. Sometimes you wonder how your own life fits in with the bigness of the world. Perhaps it gets overlooked by all of the great things that are going on. Maybe you wonder if God can listen or hear what's going on in your life. All the other important things that are going on in the world. Today we have a very personal, intimate story about Hannah. But it's set within this very large framework of what God is doing with His people to make His people a blessing to the whole world. We're at this kind of transition point. God has brought the Israelites out of Egypt, spent 40 years in the wilderness together, shoved them into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. They took over the land, and they tried to live faithful lives in the land, and they continued to always come up short. And yet God never abandoned them. God was unfailingly faithful, and yet the people struggled to be faithful. And there was kind of a conflict going on, a conflict between God's vision of what Israel should be and Israel's vision of what God should be. And they go through this period of judges. And the judges aren't judges in how we think of them. They were leaders that God raised up to address particular situations. Sometimes a priest was needed, sometimes a prophet, sometimes a warrior. But no kings were raised up because God was their king. The world seemed to be a very big place for Israel, and at one point they decided it was too big to live in this kind of ad hoc way, depending upon God to raise up people every now and then. They wanted a king. Well, the story of Hannah is a hinge point between those two worlds. Between a world in which God is king and a world in which Israel has human kings on the throne. What I find so fascinating about this story is that Hannah's story isn't there simply because she gives birth to Samuel, who will be this transitional figure. Hannah's story stands on its own merits. It speaks of a God who listens to people who are in distress and anxiety. And her life was filled with stress and anxiety. She did have a husband who loved her, but she was also one of two wives. And she had no children, but her rival had children. It was bad enough being childless in a world that valued women based upon their ability to be fruitful in that way. But how awful it was to every year when they went to temple to offer a sacrifice and to sit down as a family and eat part of that meal in the presence of God, to be reminded every year by her rival that you are without child. So on this particular occasion, she leaves the family banquet and she goes to the temple by herself. She offers her prayers. She cries out to God. Much like Bartimaeus cried out to Jesus when he was passing by on the roadside. Blind Bartimaeus was sitting on the roadside as Jesus was making his way to the temple. He cried out amidst the crowd, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowd tried to quiet him, but he wouldn't stay quiet. Son of David, have mercy on me. Likewise, Hannah comes and prays to the Lord of hosts. She thinks that the Lord who created the heavens and the earth, the Lord who had all of his hosts at his command, would listen to her. She poured out her heart, and she was so desperate, so intent on her prayer, that it was a wordless prayer. It had no sound. And Eli, the priest who is watching this, thinks it's a spectacle, thinks that she's drunk, and he begins to chastise her. But in her boldness and in her humility, she doesn't remain quiet. But she speaks up and says, "No, Lord. I'm just very desperate." She doesn't communicate the content of her prayer, just her fervency. And Eli, to his credit, blesses her. Jesus told Bartimaeus, "Go, your faith has saved you." Eli says to Hannah, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel do what you have asked of him." But Bartimaeus walks away from the encounter having his sight restored. But Hannah is not suddenly pregnant. It's not a miraculous conception. But she does go home in peace. She goes back to the banquet with her husband and that other wife. But she is sad no more. And when they return home, as is the way of things, Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, as the text says. And in due season, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, whom she named Samuel. A year later, when it's time to return to the temple, she stays back. Samuel is just an infant. She tells her husband, "I'm going to wait until he's weaned, and then I'm going to give him to the Lord." Literally. And so, a few years later, when Samuel is 3 or 4, or maybe even 5, they return to the temple. And this time Hannah comes with Samuel in tow, and she meets Eli, and in great excitement says, "I was the woman who was praying here, and look what the Lord has given me." And she takes Samuel, and she gives him to Eli, and says, "I'm going to live him to the Lord for the rest of his life. He is my gift to God for what God has given me." Can you imagine? When she does return every year with a little robe that she has made for him. And in time, she is able to produce other children. But at the time that she gives Samuel, she has no guarantee that she will ever have another child. So she gives her only son, the only son that she thinks she will ever have. And not only must that have been hard because of how much she loved him. You see, in that day and age, the only safety and security that you had in life is if you had a husband or an elder son to take care of you. So what happens in years to come when Elkanah dies and she is left a widow? Who will take care of her? Well, it should have been Samuel. She gave him to God. She not only gave her beloved son to God, she gave her future to God, trusting that God would take care of her little Samuel and that he would take care of her. She reminds me of that poor widow that we met in last week's gospel. It's Passover. There are tens of thousands of people going through the temple, throwing in their contributions to the temple treasury. And this poor widow comes and throws in a couple of copper coins. They probably don't make much of any sound, but Jesus notices. And he says, this woman, I tell you, has given more than anybody else has given. They have given out of their abundance. She has given out of her poverty. She has given everything she had, everything that she has to live on. So these little intimate stories of this unnamed widow, of blind Bartimaeus, of Hannah, they're all part of God's big story. But God's big story doesn't overshadow their lives, does not overshadow their anxiety, their stress. In one of the commentaries I was reading, highlighted kind of these two dimensions of our personal lives and the big things that are going on in the world, and how God operates at both dimensions, and how sometimes those dimensions intersect. And in this commentary, I want to read a portion to you. The author writes, Hannah's prayers are sincere expressions of her anguish and dependence on God. Hannah's anguish is real, whether it comes from her yearning for a child or from the uselessness that she feels in a culture that puts great worth on a woman's fertility. Hers is a prayer of groaning that comes from a place of utter vulnerability. When Hannah seeks out God's presence in this state of anguish, her prayer signals that she is aware of a divine concern for those who are of questionable cultural worth. She does not just come to God with formal petition. She does not come with traditional sacrifice. She comes in loneliness, isolation, and despair. She lays bare all the emotions and all the pain. Her disposition of prayer is a remarkable image of piety. Her prayer of groaning makes her an icon, not simply of the mother of a son who is prophetic and powerful, but of a human being who knows herself to be known and loved by God. It is significant that the monarchy of Israel is born in such an emotion and in such surrender to God. With Hannah's mode of encounter, the monarchy springs from a place of trust, a place of humility, even a place of mystical union. God is very present to her. God is responsive and close by. The monarchy is born out of barrenness, out of anguish and uninhibited entanglement with God's faithfulness. God's character is full of grace, full of compassion, and audacious enough to make fertile what is barren and to make abundant what is scarce. This story is a story about political power coming into its own on some level, but it is more a story about being spiritually awake. Strength and influence spring from this intense awareness of God's unique power and sovereignty. It is Hannah's humility and honesty that seem to get her somewhere, not her station in life. Hannah's hope that she not be regarded as worthless comes from a place of anxiety and lack of power. In order to exert power, she draws only on a relationship with God. This relationship allows her to unburden herself from her anxiety and vexation, and she is sad no longer. Her connection to God transforms her even before she conceives. She is empowered not by might or by political influence, but by her intimate connection to God. Hannah reflects all the complexity of life lived in relationship to this God who knows and loves humanity with such proximity. Her faithfulness is embodied in how she is drawn to God in her brokenness. Here, the God who is involved in the dynasty that 1st and 2nd Samuel will track is the God who hears and holds people like Hannah. That Hannah is inscribed with God's grace and love is embedded in the fact that she does not just ask and promise in her prayer. She also grieves, meditates, murmurs, and stands silent. She is there as her whole self, cultural baggage, broken dreams, audacious hope, and all. Hannah's child became the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the great kings. It's fascinating to me. His death is recorded in about chapter 23 of 1 Samuel. He has 2 books, and 2 Samuel goes well beyond. They're named after him. And they remain a testimony to Hannah's story, to her sacrifice. But they also remain testimony to the fact that in our intimate, small, personal lives, God is still present. God is still close. God is still paying attention. Even when God has lots of big things to be taken care of. And so when Jesus is heading toward Jerusalem, knowing that in about 5 days' time he will die for the sins of the whole world, what does he do? He stops and he calls Bartimaeus over to him. And he asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus is not a distraction. Bartimaeus is not an interruption. Jesus listens to him. And then a day or 2 before Jesus is arrested, before he is betrayed, before he is crucified, he notices a widow in a large crowd putting her coins in. Those were her prayers. That was her life. And as small as it may seem, in the bigness of the world, he noticed. The God we come here and worship notices. He pays attention. He draws close. So we are asked, we are encouraged in the letter to the Hebrews and also in 1 Peter to come with all boldness and humility into the presence of God and to cast all our anxiety on